Hey friends, thank you for being here tonight. Whether you're a returning listener or just stumbled in looking for peace and a good story, I'm glad you've joined me. We're heading back to ancient Greece, not for the usual gods and greatest hits, but for the deep cuts, the hidden gems barely visible behind Hercules' abnormally big biceps and Achilles' crowd of simps. You've heard of the legends everyone talks about, but what about the hero who fought a sea monster and still had time to argue with his in-laws? Or the one who saved a whole city and got paid in slightly nicer sandals? These are the stories of the unsung, the bold, the brilliant, and sometimes the bewildered, and I promise they're just as grand, just as moving, and maybe even more human than the names carved into temple walls. Before we begin, if you enjoy what I do, if these tales help you wind down, escape, or just feel a little more connected, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps keep this going, not to mention goodwill from the algorithmic fates. And drop a comment too. Tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is when you join me. I'd love hearing from you, but enough of that. Now take a deep breath, get cozy, listen to the lyre slowly fade into the Aegean, and let these ancient tales carry you into your own journey. You've earned this rest, and I've got a story or two to tell you. There's a saying in the ancient world that goes something like this: the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And if anyone embodied this idea in Greek mythology, it was Ajax the Lesser, a man of towering strength, endless pride, and a reputation as one of the fiercest warriors of the Trojan War. But, as we'll see, for all his might, Ajax the Lesser wasn't exactly the sharpest sword in the sheath. You see, Ajax wasn't just any warrior. No, he was big, physically imposing with the kind of muscles that could probably split a tree in half with a single punch. When he walked into a room, you'd probably notice him before anyone else. But as is often the case with people who stand out, Ajax wasn't just a man of impressive stature. He had an ego to match. Some of the other Greek heroes had earned their renown through cleverness, Odysseus, sheer will, Achilles, or in the case of Agamemnon by being the guy who insisted on having everyone call him king. But Ajax, well, Ajax had earned his name by being really good at hitting things. Now to be fair, his size and strength were no small feat. Ajax the Lesser, unlike his more famous counterpart Ajax the Greater, was known for his incredible speed and agility on the battlefield. Where the other Ajax, the massive, nearly indestructible force, was a true physical powerhouse, the lesser Ajax was quick and nimble, able to dart around with an almost surprising grace for someone built like a walking mountain. He was the kind of guy who could dart into the heart of the battle, swing his sword a few times, and then dash out before anyone could even get a good look at his shiny armour. Unfortunately for him, this tendency to be a bit too quick for his own good often got him into situations he probably should have avoided. But it wasn't just his physical prowess that made Ajax the Lesser stand out. It was his moral compass, which for all his bravado, wasn't always pointing in the right direction. Like many heroes of the time, Ajax was caught in the whirlwind of Greek hubris, that nasty little trait where gods and men alike believe they're invincible, and that everything in life revolves around their own glory. Ajax's claim to fame really came with his role in the Trojan War, where he was a vital part of the Greek forces. He wasn't the leader, but he was definitely a key player in the whole "let's sack Troy" business. There was no way the Greeks could have taken the city without him. He was fast, skilled, and made sure that everyone knew it. In fact, Ajax had one particular gift. He was known for his ability to throw a spear with lethal precision, a skill that earned him quite the reputation on the battlefield. But his Achilles' heel, pardon the pun, was his overwhelming confidence. You know the type. The guy who thinks he's untouchable and consequently makes choices that aren't always the smartest. This, of course, leads him to the type of situations where even gods sit back and go, "Oh, this is going to be good." As far as Trojan war warriors went, Ajax the Lesser had one thing that most of the other Greek heroes lacked: speed. While Achilles would charge in, cutting down enemies with godlike fury, and Odysseus would craft elaborate schemes to outwit the Trojans, Ajax wasn't one for subtlety. He wasn't exactly the brains of the operation, but when it came to charging headfirst into battle, he was top-notch. And if you needed someone to spear a guy with extreme precision while making it look effortless, Ajax the Lesser was your man. At the outset of the war, Ajax the Lesser quickly became known for his quick, almost acrobatic style of combat. Where most of the other Greek warriors relied on brute force, Ajax used his agility and lightning-fast reflexes to wreak havoc. He had an uncanny ability to move through the ranks of the Trojans, darting in and out of battle like some kind of mythical pinball. His speed made him a difficult target, and he often took out enemies before they even realised he was there. However, Ajax's rise wasn't just about his speed or his deadly aim. Like most Greek heroes, he had his pride, and as his reputation grew, so did his ego. He quickly began to see himself as an indispensable member of the Greek forces. Without Ajax, we're doomed, he would joke, or not so jokingly, with his fellow warriors. And to be fair, his deeds spoke for themselves. He was instrumental in several key battles, charging into the heart of the action and securing critical victories. He had a particular knack for going after the Trojans' weakened or unsuspecting soldiers, picking them off one by one with a level of efficiency that would make even the gods nod in approval. Yet there was something about Ajax's approach to war that irked some of the other warriors. He often seemed to think he was the reason the Greeks were winning. His lack of humility, paired with his desire for personal glory, didn't sit well with many of the other leaders, particularly Agamemnon, who had to deal with his own struggles to maintain control over the Greek forces. While Achilles could at least be reasoned with sometimes, Ajax the Lesser was all about proving his own worth, and he wasn't shy about reminding everyone around him of that fact. But in the thick of the battle, these petty quarrels took a backseat to one thing: getting the job done, and Ajax did that in spades. Whether it was breaking through Trojan defences or securing key positions in the siege of Troy, Ajax's speed and skill made him one of the more reliable warriors among the Greeks. He was particularly useful in raids, moving quickly under the cover of night to disrupt Trojan camps or steal supplies. His agility allowed him to operate almost like a ghost in the chaos of the war. His most notable contribution came during the death of Patroclus. When Achilles, stricken with grief and rage after the death of his dear friend, refused to fight, Ajax was one of the leaders who stepped up to lead the charge. His role during this pivotal moment was crucial. He helped rally the Greek forces to push back the Trojans and ultimately buy enough time for Achilles to re-enter the fight. Ajax's leadership and bravery in this moment were pivotal to the Greek effort, but it also set the stage for something far more disastrous: Ajax's pride. As he continued to prove himself in battle, Ajax became one of the war's most celebrated warriors, but it was his arrogance that would eventually lead to his downfall. With each victory, he believed more and more that he was invincible, that his name would be forever etched in the annals of Greek legend. And why not? He was quick, he was deadly, and in his mind no Trojan was a match for his might. If there's one thing that the gods love, it's a good tragic irony. And when it came to Ajax the Lesser, they certainly weren't going to miss the chance to teach him a lesson. Ajax, for all his talent and pride, had grown so certain of his invincibility that he failed to realize one simple truth: the gods can be real party poopers when it comes to human pride. The turning point came after the Greeks had finally breached the walls of Troy, and the city was all but theirs. The Trojans, broken and desperate, were on the defensive, and victory was within reach. Ajax had fought valiantly throughout the war, and now, with the city falling, his ego was soaring to new heights. He felt invincible. He had done it all. He'd fought the hardest, led the charge, and had earned his glory. What more could a hero like him want? Surely he would be the one to claim the spoils of war and ensure his name would be remembered forever. Enter the spoils of war, specifically the armour of Achilles. When Achilles was killed by Paris, it was clear that his armour would become a symbol of great prestige. It was more than just a set of armour. It was a divine relic, the very symbol of the might of the Greeks' greatest warrior. It was the ultimate prize. Whoever claimed it would forever be seen as the rightful heir to Achilles' glory. The Greeks, ever eager for spoils, decided that the armour would be awarded to either Odysseus or Ajax, two of the most important and respected warriors on their side. Now, Odysseus, though a brilliant tactician, was not known for his physical prowess. Ajax, on the other hand, was. He had all the qualities that seemed to make him the perfect candidate for the prize: strength, honour, and, let's be honest, His ego was so large that he probably thought the armour had his name engraved on it. But when the armour of Achilles was awarded, the decision did not go to Ajax. It went to Odysseus. Why? Because Odysseus had proven himself in a way that Ajax simply could not. While Ajax had charge after charge, Odysseus had won the favour of the gods with his cunning and wit. He had outsmarted the Trojans with the famous Trojan horse, proving that sometimes brains win over brawn. Ajax was furious. This wasn't just a slight to his honour, it was a public humiliation. The gods, in their divine wisdom, had chosen the cunning Odysseus over the mighty Ajax, and the news hit him like a sword to the chest. But Ajax wasn't one to take defeat quietly. His pride burned with fury, and he could not accept that the armour he thought was rightfully his would go to anyone else. Driven by rage and a sense of betrayal, Ajax the Lesser decided to take matters into his own hands. That night he snuck into the Greek camp, intent on killing Odysseus and reclaiming the armour for himself. His plan was simple. If he couldn't have the armour through honour, he would simply take it by force. But as he crept into the night, a strange thing happened. The gods, who had been watching his every move, decided to have a little fun at his expense. In a twist of divine irony, the gods made Ajax think he was attacking Odysseus's men. He went into a frenzy, slaying anyone he encountered, but not Odysseus. In fact, the men Ajax killed weren't Greek at all. They were his own comrades. His rage, his thirst for vengeance blinded him to the reality of his actions. By the time he realized what had happened, it was too late. He had killed the very soldiers he had fought beside. The next morning Ajax woke to the horrific realization of what he had done. He had betrayed his own people, all in the name of his misplaced pride. There was no going back from this. The honour he sought was now lost forever. No one could respect a man who had slaughtered his comrades out of sheer arrogance. Devastated and overwhelmed with guilt, Ajax the Lesser realized that his great fall had come not because of his strength, but because of his hubris, his refusal to accept that the gods had a hand in shaping his fate. Pride, the one thing he had always relied on, had become his undoing, and in that moment he knew that no matter how many battles he won, his legacy would now be forever stained by the deaths of his own men. After the bloodshed in the camp, Ajax the Lesser stood alone, surrounded by the ghosts of his actions. The great warrior who had once been feared and respected now found himself stripped of the very honour that had driven him. He had taken life, not in battle where he had always excelled, but in a blind fury fueled by his own ego. He had slain his own comrades, men who had fought alongside him through thick and thin. The weight of their deaths pressed down on him like a stone, and the reality of what he had done began to sink in. For the first time in his life, Ajax the Lesser felt the full weight of his pride, the same pride that had once propelled him to the front lines, that had made him the fearsome warrior he had been. But now his pride felt like an anchor, dragging him deeper into despair. He was no longer the hero who had struck terror into the hearts of the Trojans. He was the man who had murdered his own people in his quest for glory. His mind raced with a mix of regret, shame, and self-loathing. As the Greeks learned of Ajax's actions, the response was immediate and unforgiving. The warriors, who had once cheered his name on the battlefield, now turned away from him, their faces clouded with disbelief and anger. Achilles, even in his absence as he had already withdrawn from the war, had earned more respect than Ajax ever could at that moment. Ajax's name, once spoken with reverence, was now whispered with a sense of unease. He had become the very thing he had fought so hard to avoid, a disgrace. Even the gods who had watched the events unfold seemed to pass judgment on him. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, had always been a supporter of Ajax's bravery, but now she could not ignore the depths to which his pride had taken him. Zeus, the king of the gods, may have respected warriors like Ajax, but even he knew that pride could destroy the greatest heroes. As Ajax wandered the battlefield plagued by his conscience, he could hear the voices of his fallen comrades calling to him. They were not just the voices of the dead, they were the voices of his own guilt. "Why did you do it?" they seemed to ask. "Why did you kill us?" But Ajax did not have an answer. There was no justification for what he had done. The gods had given him no punishment because he had already given himself the greatest punishment of all. He had lost his honour. His pride had been his greatest weapon, but now it had turned against him, leaving him empty, hollow, and broken. The Greeks, in their judgment of him, decided that Ajax's actions could not go unpunished. The prize of the armour of Achilles, which he had fought so fiercely to claim, was ultimately awarded to Odysseus, and it was now a symbol of all Ajax had lost. In a final, desperate attempt to reclaim his honour, Ajax made a fateful decision. He would take his own life. In his mind, the only way to redeem himself was through death, a death that would wash away his guilt and restore the honour he had once held so dear. But as he prepared to end his life, something else began to stir in him, a moment of clarity. He realised that death, while it might cleanse his soul in the eyes of the gods, would not erase his mistakes. His pride, his arrogance, his fatal flaw. Those were things he could never undo. He could not take back the lives he had destroyed, and no matter how he ended his life, his legacy would be forever tainted. The war was over, Troy had fallen, but Ajax the Lesser had already lost. As Ajax the Lesser stood on the precipice of his fate, he could feel the weight of the entire Trojan war pressing down on him. His mind swirled with guilt, rage and despair as he looked upon the battlefield that had once been a place of glory and honour. Now it felt like nothing more than a graveyard of his mistakes, a place where heroes had died for causes they believed in, and where Ajax himself had been consumed by the very pride that had once defined him. The gods had turned their eyes away from him, their favour no longer granted. Athena, who had once watched over his victories, now seemed to mock him, as though to say, "You brought this upon yourself, Ajax." His honour, the very thing he had fought for, was shattered beyond repair. His attempt to reclaim it by killing Odysseus and taking the armour of Achilles had backfired in the most catastrophic way possible. He had slaughtered his own men, and in the end his enemies were left untouched. He had been reduced from the mighty hero of Troy to a man who couldn't even stand in the light of his own glory. In a final fit of rage and confusion, Ajax made his way to a secluded spot near the Greek camp, his sword in hand. The gods, who had orchestrated so much of his downfall, had left him with no escape but his own death. His desire to regain his honour and prove his worth to the gods had turned into an obsession, and now he saw no way out. He knelt, gazing at the sword in his hands, reflecting on the men he had killed, his own brothers in arms, the soldiers who had followed him through countless battles. He had murdered them without thinking, driven by a sense of entitlement and pride. How could he face them now in the afterlife? In his madness, Ajax the Lesser believed that death was the only solution, that his end would bring the redemption he so desperately sought. But the gods, having watched his descent into folly, had one final twist in store for him. Just as he was about to strike the fatal blow, the goddess Athena, ever the trickster, intervened. She clouded Ajax's mind further, twisting his perceptions until he no longer saw the Greek warriors around him. Instead, he believed he was slaying his enemies. His sword crashed down again and again, but it wasn't the Trojans he killed. It was his own comrades, his brothers in arms who had returned victorious from Troy. When the madness cleared, Ajax found himself surrounded by the bodies of his fallen friends, men who had fought beside him in the siege of Troy. His own actions had destroyed them, and he was left standing among the wreckage of his pride and hubris. The realization hit him with the force of 1,000 ships. He had become the monster he had always feared. His soul, once driven by honour and glory, was now stained by the blood of the very men he had sworn to protect. And in the midst of his despair, Ajax realized there was only one thing left to do. With no hope left, Ajax fell on his sword, a death he believed would restore his honour. His body was found by the Greeks, and though there was mourning, it was tinged with guilt and shame, for Ajax had not died a hero's death. His end was the consequence of his unyielding pride, and though he had once been a warrior worthy of song, he was now a cautionary tale. The Greeks, despite their victory, could not forget the tragic figure of Ajax the Lesser, the hero who had been undone by his own pride and arrogance. In death, he became a symbol of the danger of hubris, a warning that even the greatest warriors could be broken by their own egos. When the Trojan War ended, and the Greeks sailed back to their homeland, the victorious warriors returned not as heroes, but as men burdened with the weight of the gods' games, the consequences of their own actions and the toll of a war that had claimed so many lives. Among them was Ajax the Lesser, whose death, though significant, was one that left behind more questions than answers. In the years following his tragic demise, the story of Ajax the Lesser became one that Greek mothers would whisper to their children, not as a tale of glory, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the mightiest warrior can be undone by their own arrogance. His name was spoken not in song, but in hushed tones, for his legacy was not the stuff of heroes. It was the legacy of a man who was far too full of himself to see the path that the gods had laid out for him. His tale was one of great promise, but also of great ruin. When word of his suicide reached Sparta, the reaction was one of sorrow, but also of profound discomfort. Menelaus, who had fought beside Ajax and watched him rise to glory on the battlefield, could not bring himself to mourn the man who had slaughtered his own comrades. Instead, he stood in silence, the weight of Ajax's actions hanging between them. How could the Greeks celebrate a man who had died so disgracefully? How could they honour a warrior who had killed his brothers in arms out of pride and vengeance? In his final moments, Ajax had hoped to restore his honour, to find redemption in death. But the gods, as they so often did, denied him that. His death did not purify him. It only deepened the stain of his arrogance. The divine punishment was not immediate, but it was felt in the legacy Ajax left behind. The gods had turned their backs on him, and his death only cemented their judgment. Athena, who had once favoured Ajax, could not help but shake her head at his fate. She had seen it all unfold, the warrior's rise, his arrogance, his blind rage. She had watched as he thought himself invincible, only to fall prey to the very flaw that had undone so many before him. Hubris, the pride that led mortals to believe they could control their own fate, was Ajax's true downfall. Such is the price of hubris, Athena would say, though no one was left to listen. Yet despite his tragic end, Ajax the Lesser was not forgotten entirely. His name would still be remembered, but not in the same way as heroes like Achilles or Odysseus. He was not remembered for his brilliance in battle, but for the humbling lesson he left behind. His was a legacy not of triumph, but of tragic wisdom. He had been the victim of his own pride, and in his fall the Greeks learned that even the greatest warriors could be undone by the very flaw that made them great. As for Helen, who had once been the spark of the war and the cause of so much bloodshed, she lived on with Menelaus in Sparta. Their reunion, though tainted by the war, was one of quiet reflection. Menelaus, who had seen firsthand the cost of pride and loss, did not speak of Ajax often, but he did not forget him. He understood that in war there were no true victors, only those who survived the chaos and those who succumbed to it. Ajax's legacy was not one of glory. It was a lesson, and a painful one at that. His life and death served as a warning to the Greeks, reminding them that no matter how strong or skilled they were, the gods could turn on them at any moment. Ajax the Lesser would be remembered not as the mighty hero of Troy, but as the tragic figure who learned too late that pride comes before the fall, and that even the most powerful warrior can be brought low by his own arrogance. Though the Trojan War had ended, Ajax the Lesser's legacy continued to ripple through the annals of Greek myth. His tale was one of caution, a grim reminder that no matter how strong, swift or skilled a man may be, the gods always have the final word. For the warriors who followed in his wake, the story of Ajax was one they would hear often, not as a tale of heroic triumph, but as a tragic lesson about the dangers of unchecked pride. In the years following his death, the Greeks would remember Ajax not for his victories, but for the bitter consequences of his arrogance. His story became a cornerstone of their understanding of hubris, the belief that mortals could stand equal to the gods. Ajax the Lesser had thought himself untouchable, and in doing so he had sealed his fate. His story was told by bards in the great halls of Greece, not as a tale of glory, but as a warning to the next generation of warriors. Pride, the bards would say, is a fire that burns brightest in the strongest warriors, and the gods will not let it go unchecked. But Ajax's legacy was not just one of doom. The Greeks recognized that, like all heroes, his story was complex, a mixture of bravery, recklessness, and tragic flaws. His courage in battle had been undeniable. His quick thinking on the battlefield had saved many Greek lives, and his actions during the Trojan War were not to be forgotten. Ajax the Lesser had been a hero in his own right, fierce, unyielding, and determined. Yet his fatal flaw, his inability to reconcile with the gods, and his overwhelming desire for personal glory had led him to a tragic end. Even Helen, who had been at the heart of the war and who had witnessed the effects of Ajax's pride firsthand, carried a heavy heart as she reflected on the cost of it all. After all, it was her beauty which had sparked the war that had brought all these heroes to Troy. She lived with the knowledge that her actions, though never intended to start a war, had led to the downfall of so many men, and Ajax, in many ways, had been one of the greatest of these tragic figures. While she was with Menelaus, her thoughts often turned to the men who had fallen and the sacrifices they had made, Ajax included. His pride, in her eyes, had taken him from a hero to a cautionary tale. The great warrior who once charged into battle with the fury of a lion had ended his life with the futility of a man who could not accept his own flaws. For those who came after Ajax, his story remained a solemn reminder of the dangers of hubris. The Greeks, who had always revered their heroes, understood that greatness came not just from victory, but from the ability to accept one's limitations. The story of Ajax the Lesser was woven into their culture as both a symbol of what could be achieved and a warning of what could be lost. No one was immune from the gods' judgment, and even the mightiest heroes could fall. In the grand tapestry of Greek mythology, where the gods were as capricious as they were powerful, Ajax the Lesser would be remembered as one of the tragic figures whose actions were shaped by their inner demons. His pride may have propelled him to greatness, but it was his downfall that truly defined him. Ajax's legacy was not written in the blood of the Trojans he killed, or the victories he claimed, but in the lesson he left behind. Even the greatest heroes must remain humble before the gods, for it is pride that leads to a hero's ultimate fall. If Oedipus had lived in the modern world, he would probably be the kind of guy who walked into a bar, challenged the strongest guy there to a fight, and walked out with the title of Alpha, all while looking perfectly cool, like he was just passing through. Oedipus, however, lived in a time where being the strongest guy around didn't just get you a pat on the back, it could get you a reputation, a beautiful wife, and maybe even the attention of a few gods. Born to Arene and Polychaon, Oedipus was raised in the wild hills of Messenia, where toughness was not just a virtue, it was a necessity. From an early age, it was clear that Oedipus wasn't going to be the kind of guy who could be bullied into doing anything. He had the kind of natural strength and attitude that could have him holding his own against anyone, and probably even a few gods if it came down to it. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. Before he became a hero, Oedipus was just another young warrior, eager to prove his worth. He had the physique, the arrogance, and the ambition of a man who was sure that greatness was his destiny. The gods, however, had other plans. While most mortals would have been content to just live a good life and die with a few decent stories to tell, Oedipus was destined for much more dramatic tales. Why? Because as with many Greek heroes, love and divine intervention would soon get him into a lot of trouble. Enter Marpessa, a beautiful and fiercely independent woman who would become the focal point of Oedipus's heart, and of course, his rage. It was love at first sight for Oedipus, and he quickly decided that she was the one for him. But there was just one tiny problem. Apollo, the god of the sun, also had his eye on Marpessa. Now, while most gods would probably back off once a mortal caught the eye of another god, Apollo wasn't the type to take no for an answer. The Greek gods were known for their lack of restraint when it came to things like love, pride, and throwing mortals into complicated situations. Oedipus, being a mortal man who didn't particularly care about Apollo's divine status, was not the type to back down from a challenge. When Apollo and Oedipus found themselves in a standoff over Marpessa, it wasn't just a romantic rivalry. It was a battle for pride, for the heart of a woman, and of course, for the fate of a mortal against a god. Spoiler alert, mortal 1, god 0. Oedipus won the right to marry Marpessa, and that's when things really started to get complicated. But first, let's take a look at his rise to prominence, and how he became the kind of hero whose name would be written in the myths, but not exactly for all the right reasons. After winning Marpessa's hand from Apollo, Oedipus became not just a hero of Messenia, but also a name whispered across Greece. It was the sort of victory that would make most men puff out their chests and strut around, claiming their place in the world, but for Oedipus, it was just the beginning. He wasn't just a man who had outwitted a god, he was a man whose future was as wild and unpredictable as the gods themselves. With Marpessa by his side, Oedipus grew more determined than ever to prove his worth. He became known for his feats in battle, and his reputation spread like wildfire across Greece. His greatest skill, aside from being able to outmuscle just about anyone in his path, was his ability to outsmart the very gods who had once tormented him. No longer content to be just another footnote in Greek myth, he began to seek out challenges that would cement his name in the chronicles of Greek heroism. Idas became a hero of notable deeds. He helped lead the Argonauts in their quest for the Golden Fleece, proving his mettle on a team of legendary figures. The gods had given him no easy path. Jason, the leader of the Argonauts, was a noble enough figure, but he wasn't exactly known for his physical prowess. That's where Idas came in. He didn't just provide muscle, he led his men with cunning, fearlessness, and a sense of determination that made him invaluable to the mission. The Argonauts encountered all sorts of dangers: giant clashing rocks, deadly monsters, and of course the ever-present meddling of the gods. But despite all the divine interference, Idas was always a step ahead. When the going got tough, he took charge, using his strength and sharp mind to outmaneuver their enemies. His bravery on the journey was undeniable, and even the gods who had once mocked him couldn't help but respect him. They were, after all, in the business of testing mortals, and Idas passed with flying colours. Yet, as is always the case with heroes whose pride matches their strength, Idas's actions began to reflect his growing arrogance. Despite the immense respect he commanded, he started to believe that he could take on any god or any challenge without consequences. He had won the love of Marpessa from Apollo, after all. Surely he was invincible. This overconfidence, though, would soon prove to be his undoing. During one of their quests, Idas and the Argonauts found themselves facing the savage giant Antaeus, a beast who was known for his immense strength. Unlike most warriors, Antaeus derived his power from the earth itself. Each time he fell, he was able to rise again by touching the ground. Idas, never one to shy away from a fight, was determined to defeat the giant, but he had a plan. His first mistake was thinking that a quick physical win was all that was required to defeat the giant. And Antaeus, who was certainly no amateur when it came to battle, was far from being just another foe. Despite his arrogance, Idas did manage to outsmart Antaeus, but not without significant consequences. His victory was hard-earned and ultimately soured by a chain of events that led him to realize that the gods never fully let go of their pawns. He had managed to kill the giant, but in doing so, he unwittingly angered Hercules, who had once shared a bitter rivalry with the giant, believing that Idas had stolen his glory. Idas, who had once believed that he could do no wrong, found himself entangled in the divine games yet again. Though he was celebrated as a hero by the Argonauts and was praised for his strength and cunning, the gods looked on with amusement, knowing all too well that no mortal, especially one as prideful as Idas, was immune to their whims. By now, Idas had earned a reputation as one of the fiercest warriors in Greece. The Argonauts knew him as a leader, someone whose strength could turn the tide of battle, and even the gods, with all their power and might, had come to view him as a threat. It was clear to Idas that no one could match him, not even the gods. He had already bested Apollo, taken on Antaeus, and shown that his courage knew no limits. The more victories he earned, the more convinced he became that his fate was his own to control, that no god could decide his path but him. But there is a saying in Greek myth that the gods always have the last laugh, and, as it turned out, Zeus was about to have a good chuckle at Idas's expense. It all started when Idas and Marpessa were travelling in the lands of Macedonia. There, the couple encountered a powerful oracle, a seer who claimed that the gods would soon test their love and Idas's true strength. Naturally, being the bold, confident man he was, Idas brushed off the oracle's warning. What do gods know of love, he thought. What do they know of me? If the gods were going to test him, he was more than ready to face them head on. The test came sooner than he expected. While Idas and Marpessa were enjoying a rare moment of peace by a riverbank, a bolt of divine fury struck the earth. Zeus, in his infinite and often cruel wisdom, had decided that Idas's confidence had crossed the line into hubris, and it was time for him to face a divine reckoning. Without warning, Zeus sent a storm of lightning bolts to the skies, and Hermes appeared in a flash of light. The messenger god was tasked with delivering a message that would mark the beginning of Idas's downfall. "Idas," said Hermes, his voice tinged with divine authority, "you may have bested the gods once, but that arrogance will be your undoing. The gods will not tolerate this disrespect. The challenge now is not a matter of battle, but of spirit." With those words, Hermes vanished, leaving Ida shaken and confused. The storm that raged around him seemed to grow fiercer, and in a terrifying instant, Marpessa was swept away by the divine winds, her figure vanishing into the distance. Idas, in his fury and desperation, raced after her, determined to save her. But as he crossed into the mountains, he soon realized that the more he tried to catch up, the farther away she seemed. No matter how fast he ran, Marpessa remained just out of reach, as if the gods themselves were pulling her away. The winds howled louder, and Idas's exhaustion grew with each step. Finally, as he stumbled across a rocky precipice, a familiar voice rang out. "You cannot outrun fate, Idas," a cold voice called out from behind him. It was Apollo, the very god who had once loved Marpessa, who had now come to remind Idas of his place. "You believed that you could fight the gods," Apollo continued, his voice echoing with divine power, "but no mortal can ever outrun their own destiny. Your pride led you to this moment, and now it shall be your undoing." Idas, his legs heavy with the weight of the divine curse, collapsed to the ground, realizing the true nature of his error. The gods had granted him strength, yes, but they had also twisted that strength into arrogance. His challenge to them had been his own doing, and now the consequences were clear. Marpessa was lost to him, and his own fate had been sealed. The winds had died down, and the sky was clear. Idas was left alone in the quiet aftermath of the god's wrath, standing amidst the barren hills of Macedonia. He had always believed that his strength, his skill, and his will could overcome anything. He had grown up in a world where only the strongest survived, where power was everything. He had led the charge for the Argonauts, faced monsters, defied the gods, and come out victorious. But now, all of that seemed meaningless. The gods had reminded him of his place, and there was no victory to claim, only a hollow defeat. His heart felt as though it was being squeezed from all sides. The anger that had driven him in battle, the pride that had made him who he was, all now seemed like chains weighing him down. He could no longer look at the world through the eyes of a warrior who saw only glory and triumph. His perception had been shattered. "What was it all for?" he whispered into the silence. His voice barely carried above the sound of his ragged breathing. He had fought for Marpessa, had stolen her away from Apollo, and won her heart. He had thought, in his arrogance, that nothing could stand in his way. But now, she was gone. Not to another man, but to the whims of fate itself. The gods, as always, had played their part. Apollo, the god of the sun, the very one who had once loved Marpessa, had intervened with his divine power, and Idas's victory was turned into a bitter loss. He had won her hand in the mortal world, but in the divine realm he was just a man, a plaything in the gods' eternal game. He had no control over her fate, and now she was lost to him forever. The gods had swept her away, just as they had swept away his glory, his reputation, and everything he thought he had earned. He felt a pang of despair so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. Marpessa, the woman he had fought for with all his might, had disappeared as though she had never existed. His love for her, once so strong and unshakable, now felt like a distant memory, lost in the fog of divine intervention. What was love if it could be stolen away with a mere word from a god? What was the point of fighting for something if it could be taken away without warning? As Idas wandered through the hills, the once proud warrior was now a shadow of his former self. His thoughts spiraled into despair. "What was I supposed to do?" he asked aloud. But the mountains only echoed back his own pain. "I loved her. I fought for her. But none of it matters." His mind raced, unable to find any answers. He could no longer blame the gods for his situation. The truth was that he had been blinded by his pride and his belief that he could control everything. He had always been so sure of himself, so certain of his place in the world. But the gods had shattered that illusion, and now he had nothing. He could still feel the weight of the guilt hanging over him like a thick fog. He had killed Antaeus, the giant, and in doing so had inadvertently provoked Hercules, who had considered it his own battle to finish. He had killed others along the way, thinking that his strength would earn him respect, but he had never once stopped to consider the moral cost of his actions. His victories had come at a steep price, but now that the war was over, the victories seemed hollow. He had won battles, but lost himself, and now he was left alone to wrestle with the consequences. The pain was overwhelming, Idas wanted to scream, to lash out at the gods, to demand they give him what he thought was rightfully his love, his honour, his pride. But he knew deep down that no matter how much he raged, no matter how much he fought, there would be no changing what had been done. Marpessa was gone. The gods had made sure of that, and no amount of strength or fury could bring her back. As the days passed and the weight of his guilt sank deeper into his soul, Idas was left with a choice. He could continue to fight the gods, continue to rage against fate, but he knew in his heart that it would be a fruitless endeavour. Or he could accept his fate, recognise that he had been humbled by forces beyond his control, and seek redemption in the only way he knew how, by owning his mistakes. But could he do that? Could a man who had been so proud ever truly accept the weight of his own flaws? "What is left for me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustling of the trees. "The gods will never forgive me. I have nothing left to fight for." The reality hit him with full force. He had lost not just Marpessa, but his own sense of self. The man who had once stood proudly among the greatest of heroes was now just a broken figure, wandering through the mountains with nothing but his regret and his shame. In the silence of the hills, Idas realised that the only way forward was through acceptance. He would never regain the love he had lost. He would never be the man he once was. But if he could learn to live with his mistakes, to accept his limitations, perhaps there was a sliver of peace waiting for him. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could find a way to make amends for the suffering he had caused. The days that followed the storm of divine retribution were a blur for Idas. Each step he took through the desolate hills felt heavier, as if the very earth beneath him was pushing him down. The once confident, powerful man who had proudly stood among the Argonauts was now a shell of himself, broken, defeated, and consumed by a despair so deep that it seemed to swallow all hope. His love for Marpessa had been the driving force behind his actions, his quest for glory, and his belief that he could control his own destiny. But now she was lost to him, not because of a rival lover or a superior warrior, but because of forces far beyond his comprehension. The gods, with their petty games and cruel whims, had taken everything from him. His victory over Apollo, his strength in battle, his pride, all of it had amounted to nothing in the face of fate. He had defied the gods, and they had repaid him with a lesson in humility that he would never forget. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him with every passing moment. He had murdered those who had trusted him, people who had once fought at his side. Antaeus, the giant, was dead at his hand, and while he had thought his victory was one of glory, it had only led to conflict with Hercules, and further consequences with the gods. His reputation, once built on his strength and cunning, had now been irreparably tarnished. The realization gnawed at him like a hunger he couldn't satisfy. Nothing he did would ever be enough to undo his mistakes. The gods had stripped him of his pride, his love, and his honour. He could fight on, continuing to rage against fate, but he knew now that it would be futile. He had been humbled by the gods, and he had learned the hard way that no matter how strong a man was, he could not escape their will. In the silence of the mountains, Idas sat alone, staring at the horizon. The land stretched out before him, barren and empty, just like the future he had once imagined for himself. Marpessa's absence felt like a wound that would never heal, and he couldn't escape the thought that he had caused her suffering as well. He had won her from Apollo, but in doing so he had made a bargain with the gods that had brought ruin upon them both. For hours Idas sat there, his mind racing, until finally, the only thing he could think to do was return to Messenia. He had been a great warrior, a hero in the eyes of the Greeks, but now he felt nothing but the hollow weight of his own mistakes. The people who had once looked up to him as a hero would now see him as a cautionary tale, a man undone by his own arrogance. His name, which had been spoken with pride in the halls of Sparta, would now be remembered only for the mistake that had cost him everything. But even as he resolved to return, Idas knew he could not simply live with this shame. There was no redemption in the world that could fix what had been done, no journey that could undo the damage caused by his actions. He had lost Marpessa, and the love they shared would never be reclaimed. The thought of facing his fellow warriors, of being forced to confront what he had done, terrified him. He was a man who had once believed that strength could solve everything, but now strength felt like his greatest weakness. He was no longer the man who could take on gods or slay giants. He was just a man, a broken one, walking through a world that would never see him the same way again. Finally, after days of wandering, Idas found himself on a cliff overlooking the sea, the wind whipping at his face. Marpessa's face seemed to appear before him in the swirling winds, a constant reminder of the love he had lost and the pain he had caused. The gods had played their hand, and he had been the pawn in their game, but he could not accept the fact that his journey had come to this end. No victory, no triumph, no battle would ever undo what had been taken from him. He realized, with quiet clarity, that his only remaining option was to end it. He could no longer face the weight of his actions, nor could he bear the thought of living in a world where Marpessa was lost to him forever. The guilt, the pride, and the humiliation had shattered him in a way that no external battle ever could. Idas had been a great warrior, but this was his final, most painful battle, accepting the fact that he had lost it all. As Idas knelt on the precipice, sword in hand, ready to end his pain, a strange thing happened. The wind stilled, the world quieted, and for a fleeting moment he could feel a presence that was not his own. It was as if the gods themselves were watching him, waiting for him to make his final decision. He paused, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over him, as if the storm inside him had finally calmed. Perhaps. This is my fate, he whispered, but at least I will meet it on my own terms. With a final tragic decision, Idas ended his life, the sword plunging into his heart, and with it, the hope of any redemption. As the echoes of Idas's death faded into the quiet of the mountains, his legacy was sealed, not with the glory of battle, nor with the triumphs of a victorious hero, but with the tragic and painful consequences of his own pride. The gods, who had so eagerly tested him, had finally shown him the true weight of his defiance. After his death, Idas's name lived on, but not in the way he might have hoped. The tales of his strength, his daring feats on the battlefield, and his victory over Apollo were still told by the bards, but they carried an undercurrent of tragedy. No longer was he remembered as the hero who had fought valiantly for the Golden Fleece or the brave warrior of the Argonauts. Instead, his story became a warning, a stark reminder that even the greatest heroes could be undone by their own arrogance. The Greek soldiers who had once stood by Idas now looked at his memory with a mixture of awe and sorrow. How could the man who had so boldly taken on the gods have fallen so tragically? How could someone with such immense strength and courage have been destroyed by the very pride that had made him who he was? The answer, of course, was simple: hubris. Idas had believed that he was invincible, that no god could stand in his way, and in the end, it was his arrogance that brought him to ruin. His story became a tale for mothers to tell their sons, a tragic myth woven into the fabric of Greek culture, one that emphasized the importance of humility in the face of divine power. In Messenia, where Idas had been born and raised, his death was mourned quietly. The people of his homeland had lost one of their greatest warriors, but they knew that his story was no longer one to be celebrated. Idas, despite his valor, was a man who had been consumed by his own pride and had lost everything because of it. His name would not be etched on monuments of victory or sung in the halls of honor. Instead, he would be remembered as a tragic figure, one whose downfall was inevitable because he could not reconcile his pride with the will of the gods. Even Marpessa, the woman for whom he had fought so fiercely, could not escape the shadow of Idas's legacy. While her love for him had once been genuine, she could not deny the pain of his mistakes, the pain of losing him to his own folly. Idas had been the man she loved, but he was also the man who had destroyed himself with his own hands. She would forever be linked to his story, not as the woman who had been swept away by love, but as the woman who had been caught in a tragic dance with fate, a woman who had loved a man who had ultimately lost his way. The gods, ever watchful, did not feel pity for Idas. Zeus, who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless mortals, saw in Idas the classic example of how pride could bring even the strongest to their knees. He had no sympathy for those who defied him, but even he could not ignore the lessons that Idas's story left behind. It was a reminder to all mortals that no matter how great they might be, they were always at the mercy of the gods. And for Idas, who had spent his life challenging fate, his legacy became a tragic symbol of how the greatest hero could fall when he underestimated the power of divine will. In the quiet aftermath of Idas's death, his story became a legend, not the kind that inspires songs of glory and heroism, but one that rings with a painful, cautionary tone. His name, though spoken in the halls of heroes, was no longer one to be revered with the same admiration as the likes of Achilles or Heracles. Instead, Idas was remembered for a far more complex reason: his tragic fall, his prideful defiance, and the price he paid for his arrogance. For the Greek world, Idas became a symbol of the dangers of hubris, the fatal flaw that had led so many heroes to their doom. Unlike other heroes whose lives were marked by grand victories and heroic deeds, Idas's story ended not with glory but with regret, a lesson learned too late. His legacy was one of tragedy, showing that even the mightiest warriors could fall, not because they were defeated by enemies or gods in open battle, but because they refused to see the forces beyond their control. Over time, his tale spread across the land, but it was never told in the same reverent tone reserved for those who had earned true honour. Instead, Idas's story was often shared as a warning to young warriors and ambitious men. Do not let your pride blind you to your own limitations. Even the gods can humble the strongest of men. Idas, with all his strength and valour, had come to embody the cost of ignoring divine will, an important reminder that no mortal, no matter how powerful, was exempt from the gods' judgment. In the lands of Messenia, where Idas was born, his story was woven into the very fabric of the region's identity. His tragic fate resonated deeply with the people of his homeland, who had once been so proud of his heroic deeds. But even there, the tale of Idas was no longer one of inspiration. It was a tale of humility. The people honoured the memory of his strength, but they also understood the lesson his life imparted. Strength alone is not enough to conquer fate, and in his death, Idas taught them the true meaning of pride and humility. For Marpessa, the woman for whom Idas had once fought so fiercely, the pain of his loss remained with her for the rest of her days. Though she had loved him deeply, his fate had been sealed by his own actions. The gods had intervened in their love, and Marpessa, in her own quiet sorrow, realised that she too had been a victim of fate's cruel game. Her love for Idas would never fade, but she would spend her days living with the understanding that sometimes love alone cannot overcome the forces of the gods. And so, Idas was remembered as a tragic hero, a man who had the strength to defeat armies, the courage to challenge gods, and the determination to fight for love. But ultimately he could not fight the inevitable consequences of his own pride. His name lived on, not in the songs of glorious victory, but in the whispered warnings of the elders, passed down to the next generation of heroes who would learn from his mistakes. In the grand scope of Greek mythology, Idas's place was not among the great and unchallenged heroes, but among those who had failed to heed the lessons that all warriors must learn. That true strength comes not just from power, but from knowing when to bow before the will of the gods and when to accept the limits of one's own mortal nature. If you ever needed a hero to literally sweep you off your feet, Calais would be your guy. Why? Because he was one half of the winged duo known as the Boreads, the sons of Boreas, the North Wind. And when you're born with the ability to fly, that sort of makes you an instant legend. Calais, along with his twin brother Zetes, had wings that could rival the best of the gods. While some heroes had superhuman strength or divine weapons, Calais had wings that could soar across the heavens, allowing him to fly faster than any mortal man, glide through the air with ease and outrun even the quickest of chariots. Talk about making a grand entrance. While others were left running around like mortals do, Calais just spread his wings, gave a nod to the breeze, and wham, he was already at the front. But Calais wasn't just about looking cool while flying. He was a fierce warrior in his own right, with a fiery temper to match the intensity of the north wind that birthed him. Like his brother Zetes, Calais was a part of the legendary crew of the Argonauts, called upon to help Jason recover the Golden Fleece from the treacherous land of Colchis. And just like his brother, he never backed down from a challenge, whether it was battling gods, monsters, or simply outrunning a storm. Now, in the world of Greek mythology, being born a son of Boreas wasn't all sunshine and winged flights. Sure, it sounded cool, but it came with its own set of responsibilities, and occasionally a lot of annoying divine interference. Calais and his brother Zetes had to deal with the usual divine favoritism, but they also found themselves the subject of some serious mortal envy. Because what could be more frustrating than trying to run a marathon, only to be outdone by a guy who flies? Despite the constant attention and occasional jealousy, Calais didn't let the wings or the wind get to his head. He was a man of action, always ready for the next challenge and always eager to lend a hand to his fellow Argonauts. Whether it was scouting out dangerous territories or helping Jason and the others overcome incredible odds, Calais was always flying high, and often a bit ahead of the rest. But there was something else about Calais that made him unique among the Argonauts. While Zetes was often the more impulsive of the two brothers, Calais had a bit more restraint. He was still quick to act, but he had a way of seeing things in a way his brother didn't, especially when it came to the more diplomatic side of their adventures. While his brother might have just charged in with blazing speed, Calais was often the one to think through their next move, just fast enough to make a difference, but not so fast that he missed the bigger picture. This balance between speed and thought made Calais a unique asset to the team. Though he shared the same divine heritage as Zetes, Calais was more than just the winged warrior. He was a strategist, someone who could rise above the chaos of battle and see what others could not. The two brothers complemented each other perfectly, and together they were a force to be reckoned with in the world of Greek heroes. So when Jason called on the greatest warriors and heroes of Greece to join him in the quest for the Golden Fleece, Calais was more than ready to take to the skies once more, this time with the fate of an entire mission on his wings. From the moment Calais and his brother Zetes joined the Argonauts, it was clear that their presence would change the course of the quest. While the Argonauts were already a group of impressive heroes, including figures like Heracles, Orpheus and Jason, the addition of two winged warriors took things to another level. With the ability to fly, Calais had a distinct advantage over any obstacles that required speed and agility, and he quickly became one of the most vital members of the team. But Calais wasn't just about soaring above the competition. His flying abilities allowed him to scout ahead, bypass obstacles, and, on occasion, engage in combat in ways that others couldn't. While Zetes would often rush in with his typical fiery enthusiasm, Calais approached each situation with a bit more patience. This balance of speed and strategy made him the perfect complement to his brother, and the two of them worked seamlessly as a team. Calais, despite his tendency to fly into action, was much more calculated than his impulsive brother. One of the Argonauts' first major challenges came when they encountered the clashing rocks, or the Symplegades, which were two massive rocks that collided together whenever a ship tried to pass between them. Zetes, ever the daring one, suggested they simply fly through the gap, confident that his speed would let him pass through before the rocks could crush the ship. Calais, however, suggested they wait for a moment when the rocks were about to separate and then move forward as quickly as possible, using the team's collective momentum to get through. Thanks to Calais' foresight and his brother's speed, the Argonauts managed to sail safely between the clashing rocks, and the team was able to avoid the disaster that would have resulted from rushing into the fray too quickly. This careful planning and cooperation, with Calais as the strategic thinker and Zetes as the quick executor, became their hallmark throughout the journey. Their synergy demonstrated that quick action needed to be paired with thoughtful execution in order to ensure success. As the crew continued on their journey, Calais played an instrumental role in many other pivotal moments. His ability to soar high above the group allowed him to spot dangers from afar, whether they were monsters, divine traps, or hidden paths. There was one memorable incident when the Argonauts encountered a group of sirens whose haunting song had claimed the lives of many sailors. While most of the heroes were already prepared to block out the sound of the sirens with earplugs or other methods, Calais took a different approach. He soared above the rocks and tuned his ears to the wind, where he could hear the siren's song without it affecting him. He circled above the group, using his speed to keep the siren's song from reaching the crew's ears, allowing them to continue onward with only a slight disturbance. It was a clever use of his abilities, and a testament to how Calais' gift wasn't just about flying fast. It was about knowing when and how to use his talents in ways that others hadn't considered. But perhaps Calais' most crucial moment in the Argonauts came when the team reached the land of Colchis, where the Golden Fleece was guarded by both monsters and divine forces. While Jason and Medea worked on a strategy to claim the fleece, Calais and Zetes became instrumental in helping the team navigate through the treacherous paths that led to the dragon guarding the fleece. Calais' ability to fly allowed him to avoid many of the traps and dangers on the ground, scouting ahead and providing valuable information to the rest of the team. When the time came to retrieve the Golden Fleece, it was Calais' wings that allowed him to get past the dragon, creating the perfect distraction while Jason moved in for the fleece. With a few well-timed aerial maneuvers, Calais was able to lead the dragon away from the tree where the golden fleece hung, buying the Argonauts just enough time to act. His quick thinking and swift movements helped turn the tide in their favour, and ultimately allowed them to claim the fleece. As the Argonauts' journey neared its climax, and with the golden fleece now in their possession, Calais began to notice a shift in the winds of their quest. While the Argonauts celebrated their success, the challenges of the journey weren't over yet. Their return to Iolcus, the home of Jason, was far from peaceful. Despite the golden prize, there were still dangers that threatened the crew, and Calais, who had always relied on his speed to get ahead of the dangers, was suddenly facing a problem he could not outfly. The gods, ever watchful and ever playful, had decided that the Argonauts had grown too comfortable in their successes. Zeus, in his usual unpredictable way, sent a final trial their way. As the Argonauts sailed home, a divine storm arose, stirred by the whims of Poseidon. The storm, fierce and relentless, tested the Argonauts' resolve and their ability to stay united as a team. Calais, ever the confident speedster, took to the skies with his wings, thinking he could simply outfly the storm. He had faced many dangers before, often swooping through them without a second thought, but this time was different. The storm that raged above was unlike any he had ever faced. It wasn't a monster that could be fought head-on, nor was it a rival that could be outrun. It was a force of nature, a divine challenge that even Calais couldn't fly past. For the first time, he found himself helpless. The wind that was his ally, the same force that had given him wings and speed, was now working against him. He struggled against the tempest, his wings straining to stay aloft, but the storm was too powerful. In a moment of frustration, Calais realized something. No matter how fast he flew, no matter how much he tried to rely on his gift of speed, there were some forces in the world that were simply beyond his control. He couldn't outrun the will of the gods, and he couldn't outfly the storm of fate. As the storm raged, Calais was forced to return to the Argonauts, where they had to work together to navigate the storm. It was only when the group joined forces, using the wisdom of Orpheus, the strategic thinking of Jason, and the courage of Heracles, that they managed to calm the seas and survive the storm. In that moment, Calais realized that while speed and strength had gotten him far, they were not enough to guarantee success. The storm had shown him that there were battles where flying ahead was no longer the solution. Sometimes it took patience, teamwork, and humility to overcome the greatest challenges. His role as a hero had been based on action and quickness, but now Calais understood that heroism was about being adaptable, and knowing when to act and when to rely on others. Zetes, his brother, had already learned this lesson, and now Calais understood that his strength wasn't just in his wings, but in his ability to work with the team and learn when to step back. After the storm of Poseidon, the Argonauts slowly made their way back to Iolcus, their journey now marked by the reality of what they had learned. Calais, who had once relied on his wings and speed to avoid the consequences of his actions, found himself wrestling with his own limitations. The storm had been a wake-up call, a reminder that no matter how gifted one might be, there were forces beyond even the greatest hero's control. Calais had always been impulsive, flying ahead, acting first, and thinking later. His wings had always been his trump card, allowing him to escape danger, scout ahead, and sometimes solve problems before they even arose. But now, with the storm behind them, Calais couldn't help but wonder if his approach had been all wrong. The storm had humbled him, showing him that he couldn't always be the first to act, nor could he always avoid the consequences of his recklessness. As the Argonauts sailed closer to Iolcus, Calais spent many nights at the prow of the ship, staring out at the endless sea. The wind, his old companion, howled softly around him, but now it felt like an old friend whose advice he had ignored. What good were wings if they couldn't help you navigate the storms of life, he thought. On one such night, Jason came to stand beside him. "You've been quiet," Jason remarked, noticing the shift in Calais' usual upbeat demeanour. "Is something bothering you?" Calais didn't answer at first. He stared out at the water, feeling the weight of his own thoughts. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I used to think I could outrun everything, that if I was fast enough I could avoid the hard choices, but after the storm I see how foolish I've been." Jason nodded, understanding more than he let on. "We've all had to face our own challenges. Some of us learned the hard way that strength alone isn't enough." He paused before continuing. "What you did for the crew, The way you distracted the dragon at Colchis that took more than speed. It took courage. The same courage it takes to admit you don't have all the answers. Calais smiled weakly, the weight on his chest slightly lifting. I guess I always thought I was the fastest, the most daring. But speed's not enough. Not anymore. I need to be better than that. In the days that followed, Calais slowly began to find a new balance. His role in the Argonauts had always been clear. He was the flyer, the scout, the one who went ahead. But he had come to realize that, as a hero, there were other qualities he needed to embrace: patience, teamwork, and strategic thinking. Rather than rushing into every battle, Calais began to listen more, working alongside his comrades to come up with plans before acting. His newfound perspective wasn't just about slowing down. It was about seeing the bigger picture. He learned to see beyond his own wings, beyond his own abilities, and appreciate the strengths of others. He started looking for ways to contribute more to the group, not just as a fast flyer, but as a team player. It wasn't an easy shift, but with time, Calais found that his greatest strength wasn't in how fast he could fly, it was in how he could adapt to the needs of the team and use his abilities wisely. The Argonauts noticed the change in him. Zetes, his brother, who had always been the impulsive one of the pair, began to recognize the value of patience and restraint in their strategy. The two of them worked together more harmoniously, no longer rushing into danger without thinking. Jason was relieved to see Calais take on more of a leadership role, offering suggestions and advice when needed, rather than just charging in with his usual vigour. It wasn't long before the Argonauts faced yet another challenge, a final test before their return to Iolcus. They encountered Nereus, the shape-shifting sea god, who had been sent to delay their return. Unlike the many challenges they had already overcome, this one required strategy, something that required more than just brute strength or speed. Calais, now in a place of inner strength, took charge of the situation. Instead of rushing forward as he might have in the past, he worked alongside Jason and the others, using his wings to outmaneuver Nereus and figure out the most effective way to trap him. It was a team effort, but Calais' calm, thoughtful approach made all the difference in ensuring their success. The Argonauts' return to Iolcus was filled with celebration. Their victory over the challenges of Colchis, the retrieval of the Golden Fleece, and the trials they had endured were now stories sung in every corner of Greece. But for Calais, the journey was far from over. Though the hero's welcome awaited them, he knew that the triumph over the dragon, the harpies, and even the simple Gades had led him to an even greater personal victory. As the ship neared the shores of Iolcus, Calais felt the weight of his internal transformation. It wasn't the golden fleece he had fought for, it was the growth he had experienced in himself. The storms of the journey had not only tested their physical strength, but their resolve, their decisions, and their capacity to change. Zetes, his brother, still maintained that cocky, exuberant energy, but Calais had grown more grounded, calmer. He knew now that he wasn't just one of the winged heroes, he was part of something bigger. The impulse to act quickly, to charge in without thinking, had lost its luster. Speed was no longer his most precious asset. It was the ability to choose his moments, to act with thought, to work alongside others for a collective goal. But this newfound wisdom didn't come easily. The lingering doubts from the encounter with Poseidon's storm still haunted Calais. The storm had been his greatest test, not only as a warrior, but as a leader. It was the first time that Calais had ever felt completely helpless. Flying had been his answer to almost every challenge in life, and yet speed had not saved him from the overwhelming power of the storm. No matter how fast he flew, he had been brought down by a force greater than him. As they docked in Iolcus, he found himself quietly contemplating those moments, the waves crashing against the ship, the way he had tried to fly ahead of the storm, only to find himself battered and humbled. The memory stung. It had shown him that while wings could carry him above the world, they could not shield him from the forces of fate. That was a lesson he would not forget. And it made him realize that heroism was not about being faster, but about facing what could not be outrun, whether it was a storm, a trial of the gods, or the personal growth that every hero needed to undergo. During their final days in Iolcus, as the Argonauts celebrated their victory and began to prepare for their return to normal life, Calais' newfound wisdom began to influence others. Zetes, who had always been the more reckless and impulsive of the two, started to notice the shift in his brother's approach. He too had always believed that speed was the answer. Quick, daring decisions were the mark of greatness. But now, as Calais showed him, there was strength in restraint and wisdom in patience. "You know, maybe you were right about all that patient stuff," Zetz admitted, smirking, though there was a hint of respect in his voice. Running ahead might not always be the best option. Calais laughed lightly, his voice more relaxed than it had ever been. "Trust me, brother, I know now. There's nothing faster than a lesson learned the hard way." Their conversation was light, but in it the shift in their dynamic was clear. No longer were they just winged warriors. They were now part of a group of heroes who had to balance their own strengths with the strengths of others. Calais' role had changed, not from an impulsive flyer, but to someone who could mentor, guide, and bring balance to the group. It wasn't just Zetz who saw this change. Jason and Medea, who had long relied on the strength of the Argonauts' physical might, began to realize that Calais was not just a fast-moving asset, but an integral part of their team in more than just a physical sense. They had seen him evolve from a hero who raced into action without thinking to one who now paused, assessed, and made decisions with the entire group in mind. "You've grown, Calais," Jason said one evening, his tone more serious than it usually was. "You've learned how to see the bigger picture, and you've helped guide us all." Medea too nodded in agreement. "There's more strength in you now, not just in your wings, but in your wisdom. You've become not just a hero, but a guide to the rest of us." The consequences of Calais' growth weren't immediately obvious to the world. In fact, in the grand mythological tradition, his name wasn't as widely sung as that of Heracles, or Jason, or even Orpheus. But for those who had travelled with him, for those who had seen his journey of self-discovery, Calais' transformation was one of the most important of all. His legacy became one of adaptability, humility, and the understanding that true heroism was not about being the fastest or the strongest, but about knowing when to act, when to lead, and when to step back. As the years passed, stories of Calais were passed down, often with less fanfare than other heroes, but always with an underlying theme, that heroism was about more than just physical strength. It was about the strength of character, the ability to grow, to learn, and to use one's gifts for the good of the team. Calais, as part of the Boreds, was gifted with wings, but it was his ability to adapt and to grow that made him one of the greatest heroes of his time. The return to Iolcus was bittersweet for the Argonauts. They had accomplished the impossible. They had retrieved the Golden Fleece and survived the most treacherous trials. Songs were sung and heroes were celebrated, but behind the revelry, the journey had left its mark on each of them. For Calais, the greatest reward was not the fleece, but the wisdom he had gained along the way. And while his name might not have been as widely sung as Heracles or Jason, his legacy lived on in a quieter, more meaningful way. Calais' story, though often overshadowed by his more famous comrades, became a symbol of what true heroism looked like in its most self-reflective and mature form. The heroes who came after him, inspired by his example, would look to Calais as someone who had learned that bravery was not always about rushing into the unknown, but about understanding the moment, knowing when to act, when to lead, and when to pause and think. Years after the Argonauts' adventure, Calais remained a pillar of wisdom in Thrace. In the quiet of his homeland, the winged hero who had once been known for his impetuousness became known for his leadership. He no longer flew just for the thrill of the wind, but with purpose. His speed had been his greatest asset and his greatest flaw. But by the end of the journey, Calais had learned that true power lay in knowing when to stop flying and take a moment to think. He began to mentor younger heroes who came to him for guidance, teaching them that heroism wasn't just about physical feats or victories. It was about personal growth and adapting to challenges. Calais' lessons were more than just practical advice about battle strategy. They were about understanding that true heroism came from growth, from learning from one's mistakes and not rushing headlong into every decision. He taught them that every hero, no matter how gifted, would encounter obstacles they couldn't fly over, storms they couldn't outrun, and trials they couldn't solve alone. The younger generation of heroes would later refer to Calais not just as a legendary warrior, but as a mentor, the hero who showed them how to balance strength with patience. His story, passed down through the generations, wasn't just about the Golden Fleece or the monsters he helped defeat. It was about the wisdom and courage required to face one's own limits and still keep moving forward. Even the gods who had watched Calais grow recognized his transformation. Zeus, who had seen so many mortals rise and fall, noticed that Calais had changed the way heroes should be remembered. While many of the gods revelled in their power and strength, Calais had shown that the true measure of a hero wasn't in the battles won or the trophies claimed. It was in the ability to change, to grow, and to learn from the mistakes made along the way. As Calais aged, his once impulsive nature softened into a reflective wisdom, and his legacy became one of the most important lessons for all future heroes. Heroism wasn't defined by speed or strength, but by the choices you make when you find yourself at a crossroads. The hero who can admit they don't have all the answers is often the one who grows the most, and that, Calais taught, was the mark of true greatness. In Part 6, Extended, we reflect on Calais' lasting legacy. His story is a testament to the power of personal growth and the importance of wisdom over raw strength. After the Golden Fleece quest, Calais becomes a mentor to future heroes, teaching them that heroism is not about how fast you can act, but about how well you can adapt, learn, and grow. He leaves behind a legacy not of fame and grand victories, but of a hero who came to understand that true strength lies in character and the willingness to learn from the journey. His impact extends beyond his lifetime, influencing the next generation of heroes who will come to understand that the path to greatness is not a straight line, but one that requires patience, thoughtfulness, and the ability to change. As Calais' story passed into legend, his tale was often told in hushed tones, not for the glory of his speed or his victories, but for the wisdom he imparted to future generations of heroes. The Argonauts had brought back the Golden Fleece, but Calais returned with something far more lasting, a sense of understanding, growth, and the realization that true heroism lay not in the glory of battle, but in the choices one made when faced with obstacles, both external and internal. Calais' story became a key example of how self-reflection and personal growth were just as important as fighting monsters or claiming divine prizes. In many ways, his evolution from a reckless, impulsive hero to a strategic, thoughtful leader became an archetype that many of Greece's greatest heroes would try to follow. Heracles, Theseus, and even Odysseus, while celebrated for their strength and cunning, would all face moments where they too would be tested not by their might, but by their ability to learn from their trials. Calais' legacy, in particular, had a profound impact on the younger generation of heroes who would follow in the Argonauts' footsteps. The Boreads were among the few heroes whose names weren't always shouted from the rooftops, but were quietly passed down as models of virtue in a world often dominated by immediate victories and glory-filled feats. In his home of Thrace, Calais became a respected figure, not just for his wings or his strength, but for his calm nature and the way he helped others find balance in their own journeys. Young warriors and sailors would often come to him for advice, seeking not just guidance on battle tactics, but on life choices, on how to navigate the storms, both literal and metaphorical, that awaited them. One of the most famous stories that continued to be told about Calais after his time was the lesson he taught during the return of the Argonauts. When the group faced their final divine trial, Calais was the one who understood that it was not their strength but their ability to work together that would see them through. He realized that heroism wasn't a solitary pursuit, but one that required a deep connection to the people around you. In times of great trial, it wasn't enough to rely solely on one's strength or speed. Patience, collaboration, and trust in others became the true markers of greatness. Even the gods, who had often toyed with the mortals during their quests, couldn't help but notice Calais' growth. While many heroes were immortalized for defeating monsters, Calais was remembered for his wisdom, for knowing that even the strongest were sometimes shackled by their own hubris. His legacy was a reminder that the true challenge for a hero was not in conquering external enemies, but in facing themselves, in finding the strength to change and evolve. As the years went by, the Boreads, Zetes, and Calais became figures of mythical reverence. Their feats were immortalized not just for their physical strength, but for the transformative lessons they imparted. They were often cited as examples of how personal growth was just as important as physical prowess in the making of a true hero. Calais, with his humility and self-awareness, became a symbol of the idea that heroes weren't born. They were made through hard work, reflection, and the constant pursuit of becoming better. The wings of Calais, once a symbol of unmatched speed, now represented something more significant. The freedom that came with knowing when to soar and when to rest, when to act and when to reflect. His wings were no longer just a tool for swift travel. They had become a symbol of personal flight, of rising above challenges, and of seeing the world with new eyes, the eyes of someone who had learned the importance of patience and understanding.